Good evening. I just got off of a plane in Chicago from California. I will say it's a little cooler in Illinois. And drove here and could not be more excited to talk to not only distinguished guest here, but to work in partnership with Advance Illinois, who has a national reputation for doing good work on behalf of those who need it most. So I want to thank you for the invitation and want to talk a little bit not only about the work we're doing in California, but why equity and accountability matters today. And given the news, it seems to matter more and more every day as well. So Gina mentioned EdTrust West. I'm the executive director of a research policy and advocacy organization dedicated to educational justice and equity. We are a 100% person and or woman of color-led organization, which is unique in the research and policy space. And I will say this, famous community organizer in the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin, says, every community needs a group of angelic troublemakers. Well, I will say that I have researchers, policy analysts, data analysts, community organizers, lawyers, teachers, principals who've given up lucrative careers to ensure that we close achievement opportunity gaps in this generation, and I could not work with a more brilliant and talented team. And I'll tell you a little bit about me. So my story, and it begins here. Friday was my birthday. Thank you. Thank you. I do accept happy hour drinks. I kid. But honestly, the journey begins with the story of my mother. So this is my mother, Vicki Thompson. She literally dedicated her entire life to ensure that I received a quality education. When I was born, she realized that the most important way for me to achieve was to go to good quality schools. So she actually did the research. We were in South Central Los Angeles. Many people think of South Central, they think of the civil unrest in the 90s. Well, she actually did the research, figured out where young Black men were graduating high school and going on to college, moved us to a suburb in Los Angeles called Culver City. And 20 years later, my organization, EdTrust West, does a research report on where Black students were graduating and going on to college, and guess what they found? Culver City was the #1 school district that were graduating young Black young men and women, and they were going on to college. So I told my mother, you were a researcher and didn't even know it. You got involved in that good anecdotal and qualitative research in order to ensure that I could be in front of you today. As much as I'm happy with my mother's sacrifice, I'm also really mad about it. No person should have to spend their life savings, move across town to send their children to quality traditional public schools. They should be in every neighborhood. I believe that's the backbone of our democracy, and it's up to us to fight for that every single day. So my first job was a community organizer doing educational justice work. I was 15 years old, organizing students not only in Los Angeles, but where my mother was from. Actually traveled to Northern California, to East Palo Alto, to organize young brown, Black, and low-income students there. Went and did that, went to UCLA as a freshman, right after Proposition 209 passed. So you can imagine, I was excited, a class of 6,000 freshmen, and only 27 African-American men who got into that school in academics alone. A school that graduated the men like Ralph Bunche and Jackie Robinson had less African-American men than they did in 1967. That cemented my desire to continue the educational justice work. Graduated, had the opportunity to teach in the orphanages of Cuernavaca and DF Mexico. So para ustedes que hablan español, mi nombre en Mexico es Chocolatote Grandote. For those who don't speak Spanish, my name in Mexico is Giant Chocolate. That's what my students called me. And once again, I had experienced an opportunity with youth that fueled my desire to change the system. So I came back, did a lot of student organizing, started to do parent organizing, founded a parent college for parents in Los Angeles, particularly in Watts in South LA and East Los Angeles, places where they said parents did not care. And the picture that you see, 1,000 parents actually going to a local university, meaning they've never stepped foot on university, to figure out how they can get their children there. To this day, we had 5,000 parents who've gone through that program, all throughout Los Angeles. That is really why I do this work. How do we move from impact? And I've been excited since I've been at EdTrust West. We released a report called Black Minds Matter about 2 years ago about how we support the needs of black students. This report has been downloaded 40,000 times. We saw 1,000 black students march to the state capitol saying that you are accountable to our success. Because of this report, the Department of Education started an equity division to turn the curve on disparities that they see, particularly for students of low-income students and students of color. And we've done 9 legislative briefings with the Black Caucus throughout the state and continue to do it. And not only that, Black Lives Matter asked me to pin an op-ed on the need to support black students. That's the strength and power of the information. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about why equity matters today. How many of us have heard the term equity? I kind of like to say that equity is now the new coconut water. It's the trend we are all talking about, but not all of us are necessarily drinking. It's become a buzzword in many ways. But equity is much more than that. How many of us have seen this picture? I think this picture is very important, illustrating equity, but there's a couple things that I would say need to change. Number one, when we talk about why equity matters, it's not that people are different heights. In fact, if we're talking about students, every student, no matter where they come from, their zip code, their race, their gender, are at the same height. They have the same brilliance. They have the same talents. It's the system. We've actually built the fence higher and lower in different places. We built that. The other thing is, if equity was just about us sitting outside of a fence our entire lives watching a game, then we have some issues. We're talking about freedom. We should be in the game, playing. And not only that, we should be able to afford some tickets to watch the game rather than sitting outside the fence, right? So when I think about equity, there are some really amazing definitions out there, but this is one that I particularly pay attention to. Equity is the recognition of historical and systemic disparities in opportunity and outcomes by providing the resources necessary to address those disparities. And I will say that it's not just about resources, it's about action as well. And it's about action because we know the data are still challenging. Julian Bond, any fans of the civil rights icon Julian Bond, who passed away? He once said this: violence is black children going to school for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education. When we talk about the need for equity, it's important, particularly in the time that we're in right now. But we also think about the story of the United States when we think about education and equity. We think about there's 2 powerful stories, that we are the land of opportunity, that if you work hard, we become anything that we want to be. But we also think about this being the land of generational advancement. I know my mother said, I worked hard so you would not have to work as hard to get what I had to do to get you here. And we may remember our parents saying the same things to us. Yes, America's often been intolerant, and we know the dream is absolutely still a work in progress, but there are things that we need to applaud. We were the first to provide universal high school. We were the first to build public universities. We were the first to build community colleges. We were the first to broaden access to financial aid, and we began to see the impacts of that year over year, decade over decade. You're looking at high school diploma rates. You're looking at progress as far as BA attainment. Now, we know progress has been painfully slow, particularly for people of color. But year after year, decade after decade, we began to see progress there. You're looking at graduation rates. You're looking at BA attainment. Then, beginning in the 80s, we begin to see inequality grow again. How many of us in this room were born in the 1980s? Yes. How many of us were born in the 1990s? Yeah, you know, the more and more I do this, I see people who are like walking and talking and forming sentences who were born in the 90s. I'm like, you can come and register for a conference? And ask questions, wow. Anyway, I digress. In the 1980s, we began to see inequality grow again. In the past 4 years alone, 95% of all income gains have gone to the top 1%. You may remember the conversation around educational advancement and mobility. We know that as far as intergenerational mobility, we are now third from the bottom out of developed countries. When we look at median wealth of white families, it's 20 times that. Of African Americans, 18 times that. Of Latinos. And for a young man my age, without a high school diploma, there's a 68% chance of incarceration rate. With a high school diploma, that number drops to 20%, and with a college degree, that number becomes virtually non-existent. We talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. Here is data that show how important it is for us to fix it. Now, at the macro level, we can talk about a lot of things that factor into this. We know that issues of poverty factor into the data that we saw. We know that issues related to housing, other issues that we need to focus on. But when we talk about the individual level, what individuals can do to change the data, we know that education is still the most powerful lever to do so. And in that case, it means that we still need to invest and focus on it as a public good in order to support those, particularly those who've often been left behind. A little bit about why accountability matters, which we're going to talk a little about in the context of ESSA. Now, we know the Every Student Succeeds Act doesn't just focus on accountability, but we know that portions of the law are absolutely committed to ensuring that we have safeguards, particularly for Black, brown, low-income students, students of color. That is very important to the work that we do. Now, we've heard that accountability has had negative effects, and let's just be clear. No Child Left Behind was not perfect, to say the least. But one thing we can say about No Child Left Behind is that we did not disaggregate data by race. We did not know how our schools were doing in terms of educating low-income students and students of color. That continues to be a moral imperative of the work that we do. And we've seen progress, particularly for these students. I'm gonna go through this data really quickly, but you're seeing longitudinal data around gains made for all groups of students. This is 9-year-olds as far as NAEP reading. Over time, performance rising for all groups. Now we know that gaps continue to exist, but we are seeing progress. This is NAEP math for 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds as far as NAEP reading, 13-year-olds as far as NAEP math. We also know that rising scores do translate into big improvements in knowledge and skills. You're looking at increased proficiency rates, broken down by low and upper income students. We've seen declines as far as students who are below basic across the board. And we know that, as we talk about often, high school graduation rates are up as well. For Black and Latino students, increasing percentages with learning disabilities as well. So I do want to say this, and this is really important because we have educators in the room. We often talk about policies closing achievement opportunity gaps. We know that it's the hard work of educators, the hard work of principals, the hard work of school administrators who toil day in and day out on the front line. So that work is important, particularly as we're going to have a conversation about continuous improvement. We must support those in order to ensure that we have the opportunity to grow in our practice, particularly for teaching and learning, and that's important to say. But we know that policies can help, particularly safeguards. And I will say this, that under ESSA, we have to ensure, as we continue to build our ESSA state plans, as we think about what we need in the state of California, as you think about what you need in the state of Illinois, equity must be our North Star. Demographically, it must be our North Star. But the reason the federal government got into the work of education in the first place was to protect the rights of those who were often given the least. And we have to ensure we have safeguards in place. And we've seen what strong state accountability systems look like. You do set goals, you do monitor progress, you ensure transparency, and the most important thing is you offer supports and assistance as well, particularly where it's needed. But if you have a weak accountability system, unfortunately, we would never want to see a system where it's considered good, once again, if Black, brown, and poor children are failing. We don't want to see a system where the state average is all we are aiming for. We must bring all folks with us in the work that we are currently doing. And I will say this, because they did give me a time limit, and you know, I come from a family of preachers. We can talk. So I will say this is extraordinarily hard work. We've been working to redesign our accountability system over the last 3 years since we implemented the local control funding formula in our state. And I can imagine as you're designing yours, the important questions have to happen. The big question for me is, how is the equity imperative being designed, being measured? How are we ensuring that we're talking about particularly supports and assistance for the schools that are going to need them in the system as well? And how are we continuing to engage communities in this age of bottom-up policymaking in order to help us inform our conversations around ESSA? So thank you very much. I appreciate your time and look forward to talking to you on the panel. Thank you very much.